was a little apprehensive going into 1978's Mardi Gras Massacre. Well, technically it got released in 1983, but it got a couple of restricted screenings in 78 and then sat on a shelf for 5 years awaiting proper distribution. Always a sign of quality. The issue was, literally every single thing I'd heard about it was negative. I heard it was overly slow, I heard it was retreading old ground, I heard it had a terrible cast and poor Cine direction. Going in, I'd spoken to dozens of people about this film and not one of them had anything nice to say. The problem with Mardi Gras is, it just wasn't readily available for the longest time to check out in the UK. So when the most excellent folk at Severin and 88 Films announced they were finally bringing this thing out uncut in full HD, well, I figured I knew what I was getting into, I knew it was a video nasty, so I kind of had to cover it at some point. And given the shaky copyright grounds this thing had over the years, I didn't want to sleep on it and miss out like I did with things like Cruel Jaws or the recent HD release of Turkish Star Wars. So I nabbed it while I could, and now having seen it, well, let's just say this movie wasn't what I was expecting. So the film is, in some circles, considered to be either some kind of pseudo-remake or pseudo-sequel to the Herschel Gordon Lewis movie Blood Feast. It has some similar beats across the runtime, but what I need to stress before we get into the plot is that, having not seen Blood Feast at this point, I can't hand on heart say for sure, other than key beats that are kind of defining for Blood Feast, what is and isn't homaged here. So if I do miss any references, do let me know in the comments. Also, I have to stress that this film is super repetitive and does have some scenes that really drag on a bit, so to keep it as simple as possible, Mardi Gras Massacre follows a mysterious killer who turns up in New Orleans with one agenda: to find the most evil sex workers he can and sacrifice their precious organs to an Aztec god who may or may not grant him supernatural powers. In the opening of the film, we see the killer head to a bar a couple of weeks before Mardi Gras is supposed to be starting, where we're also introduced to some of our supporting cast members for the movie. There's Sherry and Anne, two local sex workers who operate out of the bar, and Sam, the owner of the bar, who's aware that this place is being used as a bit of a hotspot for these women to pick people up, but as long as he gets a cut in the share of earnings, he's happy to keep things quiet and will even hold the girls' money in safekeeping for them while they're out on the job. He's not exactly caring for them, but he won't see them have too hard of a time either. Anyway, our killer approaches Sherry and Anne and asks them if they know who the evilest sex worker in the bar is, before producing a roll of notes. The pair's eyes pop out of their heads, but after thinking for a moment, they point our cultist to a woman in red by the name of Shirley. After some light conversation, Shirley agrees to go with our guy, and after leaving her payment with Sam behind the bar, the pair head back to the killer's place, where he offers her a drink, talks to her for a little while, and then leads her straight into the back room that's arguably one of the biggest apartment rooms I've ever seen, complete with sacred altar and restraining bench. What follows is basically an extended scene in which our killer asks Shirley to strip off, he restrains her to the table, anoints her with oil before slicing her hands and feet, then finally cutting her heart out to offer to the gods. The next day her body is found by the railway line, and it's here that we're introduced to our main cops for the movie, Sergeant Frank Abraham and Sergeant Mayer. The pair are assigned the case, with the only information available being that the killer was clearly skilled with a knife, so to maybe check out butchers' shops and places like that. So naturally, the pair head to Sam's bar. They chat with Sam for a bit, and after a bit of back and forth, Sam recommends that the guys go to speak to Sherry, as she was the last person to see Shirley. While also chatting, Sam tells Frank that Shirley left her money with him for safekeeping, and Frank, being a grimy, dirty cop, takes the money as evidence. They chat to Sherry and she fills the pair in, confirming that Shirley worked alone, didn't have any known enemies or debts, and that she actually took up sex work for fun more than anything else. When they ask if she saw the killer, Sherry tells them that he pretty much just looked like any guy who comes into the bar, with the only new information she could offer being that the killer had a custom-made signet ring that was very chunky and very unique looking. With that, Frank decides to ask Sherry out to dinner, and after protecting her from an unexpected pimp fight in the diner, she claims she owes Frank one. And later that evening they head back to Frank's place for some bouncy. While this is going on, our killer goes to a mature strip show where he once again pays top dollar for the most evil girl in the room, takes her home and oils and stabs her. We're then treated to a lovey-dovey montage of Frank and Sherry getting food, walking in the park and getting a lot closer. This all takes place across 6 days, and at the end of the montage we're told that the second body has been found, and the chief of police comes down hard on our pair to find this crazy cultist before he strikes again, because he wants him behind bars before Mardi Gras. As a starting point, the chief sends the pair to a paranormal investigator who's aided the police previously, who rather haphazardly explains the purpose of sacrifice and a bit of the history behind it. Things then get shaken up a bit, as our killer goes to another strip club, goes to take home another woman, but gets jumped by the lady's pimp, who he pretty much beats up and throws in front of the girl he was taking home, who also, by sheer chance, pulls a knife at the exact moment the pimp gets thrown at her, resulting in her accidentally stabbing him to death. As if nothing happened, our killer then heads to another strip club, and after some of the weirdest haggling I've ever seen, he ends up taking home another girl. He awkwardly orders some Chinese food for her to eat before taking her to be sacrificed. While getting started, she reveals she's 19 and our cultist tells her to leave, presumably because she's too young to be truly evil? Who knows. Anyway, he pushes for her to go, but she basically gets upset that he's paid for her and she isn't going to get to do anything with him, so she starts undressing and complaining about his attitude, so he sacrifices her. We then cut back to a much loved up Frank and Sherry, but things won't stay that way for long as Sherry finds out that Frank pocketed Shirley's money and she's horrified, accusing Frank of being low even for a cop because they had to do a call out to scrape together the barest funds to even hold a funeral for Shirley, and had they had her money they'd have been able to give her a proper send-off. Rather than apologise, Frank gets defensive and starts slurring the sex worker. Sherry fires back, Frank gets domestic abusey, and Sherry breaks up with him there and then before fleeing to a local nightclub to boogie on down. I wish I wasn't joking, this is literally what happens. And that pretty much sets us up for the final act. As Mardi Gras approaches, the pair get even more pressure from the top to get results, damn it, and our killer kicks the old sacrificing into high gear, planning 3 offerings all to take place on Mardi Gras itself, with Sherry directly in the firing range. In a cheap and cheerful horror cop thriller, will Frank catch his cultist? Will Sherry end up a pound of flesh and a heart lighter? And how is no one able to identify this guy? He looks like Lurch and a member of Sparks got into the fly pod together. And you're telling me he's indistinguishable from any of the other clearly normal looking guys in this place? Bah, I say. Anyway, all this and more will be answered if you're okay with a bit of stupid and have the patience to make it through Mardi Gras Massacre. And honestly, for the amount of people saying this thing is slow and boring, I actually thought it was kind of fun. Don't get me wrong, this thing isn't exactly a show-stopping thrill ride, but it's awkward, weird, and downright silly enough at times that I was actually kind of glad I ended up picking this thing up. For starters, yes, it does have to be said that the script is long-winded in places. It's very repetitive, and if you're going into this expecting a literal Mardi Gras massacre, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. A lot of the film is locked off mid-shots of people exposition dumping, married up to the exact same plot beats, sometimes even including recycled shots, of our killer slowly sacrificing women over and over again. The pacing's very uneven across all 3 acts, and there's not a single show-stopping big moment in sight here. But there's something about the tone and vibe of this thing that I'm really at a loss to articulate accurately that's just incredibly endearing to me. It reminded me very much of Mr. No Legs, a film I covered last season. Both films feature somewhat incompetent cops hunting killers who are equally incompetent. And both films end with an extended car chase and have moments of weirdness dotted across the runtime. But whereas No Legs felt a bit bereft on the character front, no one really defined themselves in No Legs character-wise, here we have tons of character and tone present. They've chosen to play the thing campy, and whether it's because of the low budget or because of incompetence on the part of the filmmaker, or both, the resulting campiness and low quality creates a very unusual feeling film that feels almost self-aware in what it's trying to do but never quite commits to going full-blown comedic. The characters are all pretty one-dimensional, and almost every scene in this film has dialogue that gets awkward, clunky, and in some cases completely improvised, to great comic effect. They weren't intending this script to be funny, but because of just how weird the dialogue is throughout, it's kind of inadvertently ended up that way. And I think that's arguably what saved this movie for me. Had they really tried to play it seriously with a bit more competence, this script would have been beyond dry and almost painful to sit through. But because of the campy edge, it's inadvertently super woozy and surprisingly funny in places. The repetition, which would hinder a drier picture, actually invokes the Stuart Lee effect of starting off not funny, then when it happens again it's a bit funny, then by the third time it's irritating, then the fourth time it's hilarious. I don't have a doubt in my mind that this wasn't the intended result, but they've managed to hit a sweet spot with the tone and dialogue that means the pacing wasn't quite the issue it could have been, and a slightly uneven and almost absent act structure only helped add a sense of mismanaged chaos. Honestly, I had a bit of a soft spot for this one. I don't know how it chalks up to Blood Feast in terms of which is better or more weird, but I enjoyed what it was trying to do here and I'd happily see more films like this. The script was written and directed by Jack Weiss. He has 4 writing credits and 5 directing credits, with Mardi Gras being his final work. His other films included 2 R-rated sexploitation flicks, a PG family movie and an R-rated early proto-slasher. He was interviewed for the recent Blu-ray release of Mardi Gras, but beyond that he hasn't been seen since. On the direction front, I'm kinda torn. It's not a bad attempt for ultra-low budget cinema, there's definitely a clear vision here and Jack's been able to pull as much as he can from the teams to get the best results he can. I can't say it's particularly impressive, but for the most part I'd say it's distinct and proficient, which, again, given the budgetary limitations, is actually a lot more praise than you'd think. The issues really are more on smaller scale elements of the production that just needed that extra bit of polish. Things like the opening and closing titles being shot on some kind of shiny black paper where you can see the reflections of the crew. They play for an absolute age in absolute silence and just look cheap, almost like filler slides where the intention was to fill them with nicer things later and then they just never did. The practical effects are also problematic throughout, with the blood looking literally like the same ultra-fake looking blood from Blood Feast, poster paint red, which could be a stylistic choice, but if it is, then it's not effectively utilised nearly enough. A lot of the gore shots are performed on clearly rubber mannequins and there's almost no attempt to try and hide that. There's gaps in the narrative that create some serious continuity questions. If you can relax your brain and take this for what it is, which is a cheap and cheerful horror thriller, I'm sure you'll probably quite enjoy it. But if you like a bit of analytical meat on the bone, something to give you food for thought, you'll probably utterly loathe this film for that lack of polish. Direction of the cast is interesting also. As mentioned earlier, a lot of the dialogue is fairly stilted, and there are multiple examples of our core cast either sat or stood in a location in a locked-off mid-shot just spewing exposition at each other. I don't think Jack worked particularly closely with the cast here, as, again, there's a bit of a lack of polish to the performances. That personal touch isn't really there. It feels like scenes kinda got filtered into 2 camps. Scenes where Jack told them it was okay for them to move around the set space and actually do stuff with the props and space they had available, and scenes where Jack didn't tell them anything other than sit there and read the lines. There's also a degree of improvisation across the film's runtime. Sometimes it works alright, other times it's hilariously awful. Such as the scene where our killer orders Chinese food and takes an eternity between naming items because he just couldn't think of Chinese food items. It's amazing, it really is. And again, this all adds to that unintentionally awkward but funny tone throughout this thing. As for the cine, well, while it broadly fails the brief, it just about won me over. This film's called Mardi Gras Massacre, and there's approximately 3 to 5 minutes of footage from Mardi Gras in the movie. The rest of the film feels about as New Orleans based as it would have had they shot the film in Yorkshire. None of the tone, style or flair of the city, let alone Mardi Gras, comes across through the cinematography. And even when it's actually shooting footage of the carnival, there's nothing that specifically screams Mardi Gras about it. It could just as easily be any parade in any town for as much relevance as it has to the actual plot. Beyond that, well, composition is passable. I have some issues with them recycling shots throughout the movie, mainly in the sacrificial scenes, and one big issue I'd like to pull up with the movie is the fact that it's a very flat watch. There's not much depth of field play going on here. Everything you need to see is front and centre, and the fact it is shot so flat with such flat and floodlit style lighting for the most part just means that about 75% of the film ends up kind of feeling a bit forgettable in terms of identity. I mean, this is the only film I've ever seen that has a car chase that's simultaneously half-hearted and feels slower than walking pace. There are some decent moments dotted throughout. The sacrifice scenes have a wonderful use of colour to them, with the sets draped in golds, reds and blacks, which really helps set the tone and vibe of the location. Sergeant Frank also has the bluest eyes ever captured on film, and in the recent Blu-ray release they are piercingly gorgeous. Hashtag hubba hubba. The nightclub, strip club and bar scenes as well all have decent uses of colour to help stylise and set the mood of the place. It would have been so easy to just plonk 3 or 4 set lights down, shoot those bits all flat and have done with it, but they at least try to make these places look a bit interesting, which, even if they don't completely succeed, I thought was a nice touch. While compositionally this thing may be a little bland, they at least tried to do the best they could with it in the edit. I won't go as far as to say this is decently cut together, but given the budget and scope, I'd say it's proficient enough to just about get the job done. Scenes largely cut when they need to. I feel with a bit more B-roll it probably would have been more visually interesting, but hey, they were dealing with a tight budget and had to make do with what they could, so not great, but not awful in my opinion. Performance-wise, I was actually kind of impressed. After many experiences with these kinds of movies, I was fully expecting a drab, lifeless, barely animate cast to mumble their way through the script and get on with the next scene. But they don't actually do too badly here. Again, they're not great by any stretch, but they're absolutely better than expected. While I'll admit the cast do struggle to animate physically, again I feel that's down to a poor show on direction of the cast though, the vocal performances aren't half bad. They work with the script they're given and produce some of the most muted and odd performances they could come up with. Probably the all-round star of this thing for my money has to be Gwen Armott as Sherry, who's able to physically and vocally animate pretty solidly across the runtime. I think she probably knew what kind of movie she was in and decided to play up the melodrama, and here I think it works perfectly. She gets most of the more memorable scenes from this thing. She's confident, bright, no nonsense, and whenever she's on screen she was fab. It's shocking, honestly, that this was her last acting credit and that she only appeared in one other film, which was an uncredited role in Jack's previous movie. I thought she was really solid. William Mezzo meets the brief as our unusual killer, John, here. He has a somewhat otherworldly quality about him that's quite hard to pin down, but for most of the time he's on screen, he looks pale and clammy. He's stilted, cold and awkward physically and delivers his lines in almost the same manner. I don't think he quite manages to nail menacing, but I think he more than handles himself here, and much like Gwen, whenever he's on screen, it's hard not to get somewhat mesmerised as to exactly where his performance is going to go next. Kurt Dawson is kinda middling as Sergeant Frank Abraham. The film kinda tries to set him up as being an anti-hero corrupt cop, but it's so half-hearted in its execution that it actually ends up creating another weird anachronistic character to add to the pile. Like, all throughout the film, a lot of the supporting cast will say things in passing, like, when you get to know Frank, you'll know he's worse than any criminal. But in real terms, other than taking Shirley's money, which the film doesn't make clear even is him being corrupt, I thought he just took the money as evidence before that later fight with Sherry, and the moment where he slaps Sherry, there isn't really anything here to really give the moniker of corrupt cop. He's a bit questionable maybe, but corrupt? That's just not really here. In either case, when he's playing to his strengths as a performer, he handles himself alright. He's a bit vanilla for a leading man, but he does have his moments. It's just a shame a lot of his screen time is spent just throwing plot lines at people and having plot lines thrown back at him. As for the rest of the cast, they're decent. Like I say, I don't think there's a genuinely bad performance in this thing, and even when they're leaning that way, they're not intrinsically bad, they're just humorously awkward. And finally, the soundtrack. Frankly, it's criminal this score hasn't been released in any format since the film came out. Because, while it's absolutely inappropriate for this film, it's a banger of a disco funk soundtrack that I'd buy on vinyl in a heartbeat. It's upbeat, funky, and high quality too, which, given the budgetary limitations, honestly surprised me. It only enhances the weird tone this thing has. Disco sacrifices were not on my bingo card for this thing, but honestly, it really just made this thing stand out way more than it would have had it just had a tonally appropriate soundtrack attached to it. And more importantly, it's awesome music in its own right. Terrorvision, if you can get this thing put out, please, I cannot give you my money soon enough, honestly. As mentioned, Mardi Gras Massacre was shot in 1978, screened a handful of times privately, but didn't really find distribution until 1982. Part of that was down to the MPAA having trouble with the violence and nudity in the film, but it did eventually get a VHS release, coming out in the UK in 1982 on Gold Star. By 1984 it had been listed as one of the prosecutable video nasties, presumably because if the MPAA had trouble with the nudity and violence in the film, which I personally think is ridiculous because this thing's so fake it's untrue, then the BBFC were absolutely going to take issue with the fact this film has 3 to 4 scenes of a guy slowly sacrificing naked women. Massacre ultimately ended up being one of the rarer video nasties. It skipped a DVD release in the UK, and copies of the movie were and still kind of are fairly hard to come by. They're not as hard as, say, Devil Hunter, but in my decade or so of collecting, I've only ever seen a couple of copies on VHS of this out in the wild. Its reputation for not being all that good means that while it still costs a pretty penny to pick up these days, we're talking high tens rather than hundreds at this time. The fact that it was kept out of circulation for so long meant that, in UK horror circles at least, a lot of people only had word of mouth and increasingly ropey VHSs and boots to work with in figuring out what this thing was. So it's no wonder really that it got a bit of a poor reputation. In the US it did receive something of a DVD and Blu-ray release, though it's a bit sketchy as to whether this could be classified as an official release because the rights to Mardi Gras up until fairly recently were hotly contested and a lot of attempts to release the movie were blocked by people claiming to be the rights owners, preventing a truly official release from happening for many years. That is, until 2022, when after a few months of wrangling with the supposed right owners, said right owners unexpectedly died, reverting the rights to the film to someone else who was much more agreeable in getting the film out there. As such, Severin finally got to release their version of the film after an initial full start launch in November 2022, and in the UK 88 Films released their version in January 2023. Marking the first time that Mardi Gras Massacre had been commercially available to purchase in the UK, and the first time it had been legally able to be watched in the UK in 39 years. I went for the Severin release because, as mentioned, I didn't want to take any chances on this thing going AWOL again due to rights issues, and pre-ordered as soon as I got the chance. And I've got to say, Severin have done a gorgeous job on this release. The picture quality for a movie of this time, budget and film stock quality is really solid, with crisp, sharp colours, a hearty amount of grain giving a nice level of contrasting detail, and other than the final reel which does look a bit battered in places, this is a really nice remaster that's easily the best the film has ever looked. Extras are a little bit middle of the road. We have interviews with the director and some of the cast, a commentary and a trailer. It's not exactly a comprehensive pack, but it's way better than anything that's come before it, and it's a hell of a lot better than nothing. Mine came with a rather explicit but decent looking slipcase. If I'm being honest, I prefer 88's slip for this release, but again, it's nice looking and sits well on my shelf. As for whether I think this deserved its nasty status, no, this thing's goofy. I have to assume the violence towards women is the reason for its listing. That, and given they put Blood Feast on the list, and apparently these two films are similar in tone and ilk, it seems like a lazy but consistent addition. I don't agree with it, but I can kind of see why in their minds they did what they did given their other choices at the time. All in all, Mardi Gras Massacre isn't a particularly great movie, but it's a tonally unusual, at times visually interesting and fairly bizarre experience to sit through. I can absolutely understand why people would think this was slow and stupid, but that goofiness was exactly the thing that endeared me to it, honestly. The script's all over the place, the direction in Cine swings wildly between being flat and lifeless and surprisingly well handled for a low budget shoot, the acting's up and down, and the soundtrack made my ears melt with joy. I absolutely won't defend this as a great film, but if you're looking for a strange or goofy movie that you and your friends could maybe have a half decent time riffing on, I'd definitely recommend checking this one out.